It was October of 2019, and I had just turned 35 a few weeks earlier. I remember that year more clearly than most others because I had finally taken time off from work for something I'd been meaning to do for a long time: get away from everything. I'd worked as a mechanical engineer for nearly 12 years, and the pressure had slowly built up to the point where I could feel myself mentally shutting down. I wanted a break, not just a long weekend or a flight to another city. I wanted isolation, no people, no noise, just nature, mountains, and quiet. I rented a remote cabin in the San Juan Mountains in southwestern Colorado. It was about 20 minutes outside a small town called Lake City, a town I had never been to before and didn't know a single person in. I booked the cabin through a small, regional vacation rental site I'd found after hours of searching. It wasn't listed on the big-name platforms. That was one of the reasons I picked it. It looked private, and it was. The description said the property was 3 miles down a dirt road off a main highway, surrounded by forest on all sides with no neighbors in sight. The pictures showed a single-story wooden structure with a green metal roof, a wraparound deck, and a small stone chimney. Inside looked rustic but clean. Wood paneling, a brick fireplace, a worn leather couch, and a small kitchen with a gas stove and fridge. There was no internet, no TV, and the listing proudly stated there was no cell signal in the area. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed my old Toyota 4Runner with supplies, food for 2 weeks, a few jugs of water, my camping gear, winter clothes, books, a hatchet, a folding saw, a flare gun, a basic first aid kit, and a .357 Magnum revolver I kept locked away at home but decided to bring just in case I had to deal with wildlife. I wasn't planning to hike far from the cabin, but in bear country, it felt like a reasonable precaution. The drive from my apartment in Albuquerque took almost 7 hours, mostly up through New Mexico and into southern Colorado, then winding mountain roads until the scenery started to shift from desert browns to high-altitude greens and grays. I reached the turnoff in the late afternoon. The dirt road was narrow, muddy from recent rain, and deeply rutted. I drove slowly, avoiding sharp rocks and deep holes. After about 3 miles, the trees opened up a little, and I saw the cabin through the thinning aspen. It looked exactly like the pictures. There were no other structures around, not even a shed. Just trees, moss, wet ground, and the quiet that comes with being truly away from civilization. I parked under some pine trees, unpacked my gear, and stepped onto the front deck. The wood creaked a little under my boots, damp and soft from the weather. There was a light dusting of snow still clinging to the shaded corners of the railings, the kind that falls early in the mountains and doesn't fully melt during the day. Inside smelled like wood and dust. The air was cold and dry. I lit a fire using the split logs in the steel rack near the fireplace, then turned on the propane-powered lights and heated up a can of soup on the gas stove. That first night, I sat on the couch with a thick blanket wrapped around me, reading a book and listening to the fire crackle. I didn't realize how tired I was until my head started to nod and the words on the page began to blur. I woke up early the next morning to frost on the windows and my breath showing in the air. The fire had died overnight, and the cabin was freezing. I got up and quickly started a new one, then stepped outside to use the outhouse. There was no indoor plumbing, only a composting toilet behind the cabin, about 30 feet into the trees. The air outside was colder than inside, and I could hear nothing but the occasional creaking of trees and my own footsteps on the frozen ground. No traffic, no birds, no airplanes. I stayed out there for a few minutes, just listening. It was what I'd come for. The first few days passed quietly. I spent my time reading, chopping wood, making meals, walking short distances around the property, and sitting on the deck watching the trees sway. Sometimes I heard animals in the distance, elk bugling, maybe, or the rustling of deer. I saw fresh tracks around the perimeter of the cabin almost every morning. Nothing too big. Probably raccoons, foxes, maybe a coyote. But then on the 4th day, things started to feel different. It began when I noticed something near the edge of the forest around noon. I'd gone out to get more firewood from the pile and looked up to see something dark between 2 trees about 60 yards away. I stood there for a moment, squinting. It wasn't moving. I thought maybe it was a tree stump, but I hadn't seen it there before. I kept staring, but after a few seconds I looked away and went back inside. I didn't want to get paranoid. I told myself it was probably just a trick of the light, something I'd missed earlier. Later that evening, I went outside to bring in more wood before it got too cold, and I saw something again, this time closer. There was a patch of ground near the back side of the cabin where the pine needles and dirt had been disturbed. A shallow scrape, like something had dragged its foot or paw there. I didn't think much of it at first until I saw a second mark, about 4 feet to the side. It looked too wide to be a deer and too shallow for a bear. I didn't hear anything, didn't smell anything, but I went inside earlier than usual that night, just to be safe. The next morning I found something strange. The wooden door of the outhouse had a long scratch across it. Not deep, just surface level, like something had scraped across it with a nail or claw. I walked a slow circle around the cabin, checking the windows, the deck, the firewood pile, everything. No sign of an animal, no sign of people. The forest looked the same as always, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. That night I had trouble sleeping. Every time I started to doze off, I'd jerk awake at some noise. The wind, the shifting logs in the fire, the occasional pop from the wooden walls. At around 2 a.m., I heard a solid thump on the side of the cabin, not like a branch falling. It was firm and dull, like someone had slapped the wall with an open hand. I froze. I didn't move for almost 10 minutes. I just laid there under the covers, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, listening. The fire had burned low, casting faint flickers of orange on the walls. I didn't hear anything else after that. No footsteps, no breathing, no more thumps. But I couldn't sleep after that. I just waited for the sun. Over the next few days, I found more signs. Scratches on the wood pile, prints in the mud that didn't quite match anything I knew. A bundle of sticks stacked under the deck like someone had placed them there. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, but deep down I knew someone had been near the cabin. And it wasn't just once. I started locking the door every time I went outside, even for a minute. I kept the revolver on the table near the couch instead of in my bag. I was too far from town to call for help, and even if I hiked back to the road, it would take hours to get there. The last few nights were the worst. I stopped using the lanterns and kept the fire low to avoid making the place look warm and lit from the outside. I wanted it to look empty. I started sleeping during the day and staying awake at night, sitting quietly by the window with the gun in my lap, listening for footsteps. One night, around 4 a.m., I heard something move near the deck. Slow footsteps on the wooden boards, then silence. I waited, every muscle tense, eyes locked on the door. The sound didn't come again. But when I checked in the morning, there were wet footprints on the deck. Bare feet, no shoes. That was when I knew it wasn't an animal. I packed that day. I didn't care that I still had 4 days left in the rental. I loaded everything I could into the 4Runner, left the firewood stack as it was, and drove out as the sun came up. The road was rougher after a week of rain and cold, but I didn't stop until I reached the highway. I didn't stop again until I got to a gas station outside Gunnison, where I sat for almost an hour trying to calm myself down. I never reported what happened. I never went back to that cabin. When I checked the rental site again a month later, the listing was gone. I don't know who was out there in the woods with me or what they wanted or how long they had been watching, but someone was out there, someone who never said a word, someone who waited for the darkness. Someone who stayed just far enough away that I never saw them clearly, but I felt them, and that was enough. I was 37 when I decided to take a long break from everything. That year, in late October of 2012, I had just wrapped up a rough patch in my life. I'd been working as a field tech for a soil testing company down in central Arizona, but after getting laid off and going through a breakup within the same month, I needed space to clear my head. My cousin Jason had bought a small off-grid hunting cabin up in northern Utah, tucked deep inside the woods near a place called Diamond Fork. It was an old structure, built back in the early 70s by some retired carpenter who passed away years ago. Jason had gone there a few times over the last couple years and said it was quiet, cold, and peaceful. 3 things I needed more than anything else at that point. He gave me the keys and told me I could stay as long as I wanted. There was no cell reception out there, No power besides a small propane generator, and no neighbors for miles. It was about a 30-minute drive from the nearest dirt road and took another hour to hike up to on foot. The trail that led to the cabin wasn't marked and barely used, mostly overgrown with weeds and thick brush. That was perfect for me. I didn't want anyone around. I packed up enough supplies for a couple of weeks, mostly canned food, oats, dried meat, rice, some basic first aid, 2 flashlights, a propane heater, some books, my journal, and a .22 rifle just in case I ran into something dangerous. I also brought my old sleeping bag and a small cooler of perishables, figuring I'd eat through those first. The hike in was harder than I remembered. I'd been to the cabin once before, back when Jason first bought it, and I forgot how steep the last part of the trail was. The trees were starting to lose their color, and a cold wind kept sweeping through the branches like something invisible was chasing me. When I finally reached the cabin, my shirt was soaked in sweat and my legs were burning. The cabin sat on a slope about 50 yards above a narrow stream. It had one room, a small covered porch, and a tin chimney sticking out the back. It creaked a little when I stepped inside, but otherwise it seemed in decent shape. There was a small table with 2 chairs, a wood stove, some shelves, and a narrow cot with a lumpy old mattress. The windows were covered with plastic to keep the cold out, and a thick curtain hung over the doorway to the back porch. The smell inside was musty, like old wood and dust, but it felt solid, and more importantly, it felt far away from everything. I spent the first couple days settling in. I gathered some firewood, unpacked, set up a little cooking station on the table, and spent time sitting outside watching the wind run through the trees. The nights dropped below freezing, and even with the propane heater on low, I had to wear 2 pairs of socks and a beanie to stay warm in my sleeping bag. I liked it though. The cold made everything feel sharp and still. I hadn't heard a car, a voice, or even the buzz of a phone in days. It was like I'd stepped into another time. By the 4th day, I was starting to relax. My sleep got deeper, and my thoughts were clearer. I went on long walks during the day, following old animal trails and marking trees with chalk so I wouldn't get lost. There were deer out there, lots of them. Sometimes I'd spot their tracks in the frost or hear them crashing through the brush at dusk. A few times, I even saw them standing still in the tree line, their eyes catching the light like glass marbles. The place had a rhythm, felt natural, like it had always been that way. But then on the 5th night, I woke up to something strange. It was just past midnight, and I heard a soft thump outside. Not loud, but heavy. It wasn't wind. It wasn't a branch falling either. It sounded like something had stepped onto the porch. I stayed still in my sleeping bag and held my breath. The heater was off, so the cabin was completely silent except for my own heartbeat in my ears. Then it happened again. Another soft thump, this time closer to the door. I reached for my flashlight and switched it on, but I didn't get up. I just aimed it at the door and waited. For nearly 10 minutes, nothing else happened. I couldn't hear footsteps, no animals breathing, no scraping, nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it might have been snow sliding off the roof or a raccoon. Still, I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I walked around the cabin. The ground was damp from frost, and I looked for tracks but didn't see any clear ones. Just the usual squirrel prints and a few deer hoof marks deeper in the brush. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe I was still adjusting to the silence. That night, I made sure the cabin was locked up. I placed a chair under the door handle and stacked a few metal cans next to the door so they'd fall over if it opened. It made me feel better. That helped me sleep, at least for a while. But just before dawn, I woke up again. This time it was a tapping sound, soft and steady, like someone was drumming their fingers on the outside wall of the cabin. The tapping moved slowly around from the back wall to the side window. I stayed frozen in my bag, holding the flashlight tight, but I didn't turn it on. I just listened, kept going for almost 2 minutes, then stopped. When the sun came up, I checked the outside wall. Nothing was out of place, and again I couldn't find any tracks. The frost had started to melt already, and maybe I missed them, but I knew what I heard. That wasn't an animal. That was deliberate. Something or someone had walked around the cabin in the dark, tapping on the wood. I considered leaving that day, but I didn't. I told myself I was overthinking things, that maybe it was a bird or something scraping in the wind. I didn't want to give in to fear. I come out here to clear my mind, and I didn't want to run just because of a few creepy noises. That was a mistake. On the 7th day, something changed. The air felt wrong. The woods were too quiet. I didn't see any deer, not a single squirrel. Even the stream felt still. I tried to take a walk, but something about the tree line made me nervous. I kept thinking I saw movement, like someone ducking behind a trunk. I turned my head and nothing was there, just shadows. That night I didn't sleep. Around midnight, I saw movement outside. The curtain over the back window swayed slightly. I kept the lights off and stayed low near the floor, peeking through a gap in the curtain. I saw a shape standing just inside the tree line. It was a man, not an animal, not a hunter, just a man. He wasn't holding a gun or a flashlight. He was just standing there, watching the cabin. I didn't breathe. I stayed down until my legs were numb. After maybe 10 minutes, I looked again. He was gone. The next morning, I packed. I didn't care if I was being paranoid anymore. I was getting out. I stuffed everything into my backpack, tossed the extra cans and gear I didn't need, and locked the cabin behind me. The trail down was colder than usual. The air had turned sharp, and the wind carried dead leaves across the path like dry insects. Every so often I stopped and turned around, feeling like someone was following me. I didn't see anyone, but I moved faster. About halfway down the trail, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A tree near the edge of the trail had fresh cuts in it, knife marks wide and deep. Someone had carved a line of vertical slashes, evenly spaced, about head height. There were 12 of them, like tallies. That's when I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the dirt road where I'd parked my truck. The doors were still locked. Nothing was missing. I drove out of there without looking back. I never went back to the cabin after that. A few months later, Jason called and said he was thinking about selling the place. He asked if I'd had a good time up there. I didn't tell him everything. I just said it wasn't for me. He sold it that spring. About a year later, I read an article online about a missing person report filed up near Diamond Fork. A man in his 40s went out solo to camp in the same area and never came back. They found his car, found his boot prints, but never found him. They also found a tree nearby with tallies carved into the bark. My name is Carl Bowman. I'm 43 years old, and this happened back in the fall of 2019. I was working in construction management in Reno, Nevada. I'd been going through a rough few months. My dad had passed away in July, and I had just gone through a breakup with my girlfriend of 3 years. I didn't have any kids, no pets, and I had taken a 2-week leave from work to just disconnect and clear my head. I figured I needed time to breathe, somewhere quiet, away from noise, traffic, people, phones, emails, just total silence. A friend of mine, a guy I'd worked with years ago, told me about a small rental cabin up in the Ruby Mountains, about 2 hours east of Elko. It was up high, about 7,000 feet, pretty deep into the trees but still reachable by a 4x4 vehicle. He had stayed there once a year or two before during hunting season. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, no TV. Just a small wood stove, a solar battery that powered a couple of lights, and a propane tank that ran a tiny stove and a water heater. It had a small shower and a composting toilet in an attached shed. A well out back pumped water into a small tank when the power was on, and there was a lockbox on the door with the key. He said the place had been empty most of the year and the owner kept it listed cheap under the radar. I found the listing and booked it for 12 days. I left on a Sunday morning in early October. The weather was just turning cool, but the forecast looked clear for the next week and a half. I packed up my 2004 Tacoma with enough food to last the full 12 days. Canned stuff, dry goods, bottled water, instant coffee, propane refills, a solar phone charger just in case, a small generator, extra gas, and my .30-06 rifle, mostly out of habit. I wasn't planning to hunt, but I liked having it with me in the mountains, especially with bears and mountain lions around. The drive was peaceful. Once I passed Elko and hit the gravel roads, it started feeling like I was really away from everything. I followed a trail the owner had given me in an email, took 2 logging roads, and past a couple of rusted-out trailers and sheds that looked like they hadn't been used in years. I stopped at a clearing and double-checked the map. There was no real driveway, just a worn-out path through the brush, wide enough for my truck. I reached the cabin around 3 p.m. It sat tucked into a patch of thick pines, half a mile from the nearest trail. It was small, a little over 300 square feet, with weathered wood siding and a rust-colored tin roof. There was a small covered porch with a bench, a stack of firewood, and a metal chimney sticking out the side. A window on each wall, a screen door, and that was about it. The lockbox worked, and the inside smelled like old wood and dust. There was a bunk bed, a small table, 2 wooden chairs, and a cast-iron wood stove in the corner. The kitchenette had a sink, some old pans hanging from hooks, and a 2-burner propane stove. Everything was clean but obviously used. A small solar panel stood out back beside the outhouse structure, tilted to catch the afternoon sun. There was an axe leaning against the porch, and a rusty saw hanging from a hook by the shed. I unpacked slowly, made coffee, and sat on the porch, listening to the wind in the trees. Felt good. No trucks rumbling past, no voices, no phones buzzing. Just birds and the occasional snap of a branch. That first night was calm. I lit a small fire in the stove, made rice and beans, read for a while under a dim yellow light from the solar battery, and crawled into the lower bunk. I had a pistol under my pillow and the rifle leaning against the wall near the door. I locked up, shut the curtains, and fell asleep fast. The second day I hiked around a bit. The air was cold and dry, and the ground was soft with pine needles. I went a few miles in each direction but didn't see any trails or other signs of people. It really was remote. I saw some deer prints, a few birds, and what might have been a mountain lion track, but it looked old. I didn't bring the rifle that day, just the pistol on my belt. That night I cooked some soup, made a fire, and wrote in a small notebook I'd brought. I was thinking about my dad a lot. He used to take me camping when I was a kid, and it hit me that this kind of quiet was the same kind I hadn't felt in years. It was peaceful. I slept better than I had in months. The third night is when things started to feel different. I had just laid down and turned off the light. I had the wood stove going low, just enough to keep warm. It was dead quiet outside. I remember that because it was the first night I didn't hear the wind. I laid there a while, not fully asleep yet, and I thought I heard something outside. It wasn't much. A single footstep on dry leaves, maybe 30 feet from the cabin. I figured it was a deer or maybe a raccoon. I didn't even get up. But then I heard another one. Then nothing. It was so quiet after that I started to wonder if I'd imagined it. I sat up and looked out the side window, just past the bunk. The curtains were thin, but I could see out between the folds. Nothing moved. I listened for a long time. I didn't hear anything else, and eventually I laid back down. The next morning I went outside and looked around. I walked a wide circle around the cabin, checking the dirt and soft patches. I didn't see anything. No prints, no scat, nothing out of place. It had me second-guessing myself, thinking maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But that night, it happened again. Just after I shut the light and laid down, I heard it, this time clearer. A crack like a stick being stepped on. A slow, heavy sound, like weight shifting on the porch steps. I sat up fast and grabbed the rifle. My heart was pounding. I didn't move for a while, just listened. It was quiet for a long time, maybe 15 minutes. Then I heard a light thud on the wall. Not hard, like a single touch, like someone lightly pressing their palm against the outside wall. I didn't move for the rest of the night. I sat in bed with my back to the wall and the rifle on my lap, staring at the door. When it got light out, I opened the door slowly, then stepped outside with the rifle up. I didn't see anything, but this time, when I looked around the perimeter, I saw something strange. Under the bedroom window, there was a small scuff mark in the dirt, like someone had stood there and shifted their foot a little. The grass was bent, and a small flat patch of dirt was pressed down. Too wide to be from a deer, too narrow for a bear. No prints, just the impression of someone standing still. That day, I didn't go hiking. I stayed around the cabin, checking everything. I even walked about half a mile in each direction to look for any sign of a camp. Trash, anything that might mean someone else was out there. Nothing. No tire tracks, no wrappers, not even a footprint. I thought about leaving, but I had 8 more days booked, and part of me didn't want to run off just because I got a little spooked. I kept telling myself it could have been an animal, maybe a stray dog or some weird echo of sound in the trees. That night, though, it escalated. I had just finished eating and was cleaning up when I heard the crunch of something in the leaves outside. Fast this time, like something walking quick just past the tree line. I froze. I circled the cabin once. I stood there in total silence with the lights off, the rifle in my hands, listening to the sound of something large circling me. It moved slow again near the end, like it was being careful. Then silence. Long silence. I stayed awake all night, eyes wide, ears tuned to every sound. But nothing else happened. The next morning, I decided I had to know what was going on. I walked as far as I could that day, maybe 6 miles in total, through thick trees, gullies, even climbed a ridge to get a view of the cabin area. I saw no signs of anyone, but when I got back late that afternoon, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The cabin door was open, just a crack, but I knew I had locked it. I crept up, rifle raised, and pushed it open slowly. Everything looked normal inside at first. Nothing looked moved, but when I checked my bag, one of the side pockets had been unzipped. My flashlight, the good one with the metal body, was missing. Nothing else was gone. No food, no tools, no ammo. Just that flashlight. That night, I locked up tighter than ever. I even moved the table in front of the door. I kept the rifle loaded, and I laid on the lower bunk with my boots still on, ready to move. Around 2 a.m., I heard a noise that I still think about sometimes when I'm alone. It was a breath. Not mine, not from inside. Came through the small crack in the bedroom window. A slow, steady breath. One single exhale. I stood up fast and slammed the window shut, then shut the curtain and backed away. I waited in the center of the cabin, rifle up, and I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sun rose, I went outside and walked around the whole area again. This time, under the window, I saw 2 boot prints. Clear ones, normal size but worn. No brand, no tread, just old smooth soles pressed into the dirt. That was it. I packed up right then and there. I didn't care about the money I'd already spent. I threw everything into the truck, double-checked the gear, and I left by noon. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station outside Elko, where I finally got signal. I called the number on the My name is Ryan. I was 38 years old when this happened. At that time, I had been working as a freelance web developer for almost 12 years. My apartment was in downtown Denver, and my life was more or less what you'd expect. Busy, noisy, full of screens, full of stress. I had gotten tired of the constant notifications, the rush, the packed schedules, and the feeling that time was slipping away without me even noticing. It was early October 2021. I had hit a wall mentally and physically. I had a few long-term clients lined up, but I planned my schedule so that I could take 2 full weeks off. I wanted complete quiet, no Wi-Fi, no phone, just space to clear my head. I decided I would head up into the mountains for some solitude. Not a tent, not a car camping site. I wanted a real cabin with 4 walls and a roof. Something old, something isolated. I wasn't looking for luxury. I wanted privacy and distance from people. After some searching, I found a small, rundown cabin in a listing on a forum, not on any of the usual rental sites. Some guy named Howard was renting it for cheap, $200 for 2 weeks. No power, no running water, wood stove, completely off the grid. It was on the western slope, about 2 hours past Glenwood Springs, deep in the forest near the Uncompahgre National Forest. It looked like it hadn't been used much in the last decade. The pictures showed a 1-room log structure, weathered with a small porch, a hand pump out back for water, and a rusty old fire pit. I didn't care. It was perfect. I paid through PayPal. The guy sent me a set of GPS coordinates, not even an address. He said the road up was rough but passable with a 4WD. I packed my gear, sleeping bag, cooler, canned food, water jugs, an axe, a flashlight, a solar charger, a first aid kit, a rifle just in case, and a bunch of paperbacks I'd been meaning to read. I left early on a Sunday morning and made the 6-hour drive up into the mountains. The last 2 hours were slow. I left paved roads behind and started winding up steep, narrow gravel paths. Tall pines pressed in on either side. The elevation climbed higher than I expected. After about 5 miles of rough trail, I finally spotted the roof of the cabin through the trees. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded by dense forest. No other buildings in sight. No cell service. No tire tracks. No sign of recent human activity. The cabin itself looked exactly like the pictures. Small, made of old logs that had turned gray, and slightly sunken on one side. The front door stuck a little, but I got it open. Inside was a single room with a wood stove in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, a cot with a bare mattress, and a few shelves. Dust covered everything, and mouse droppings lined the corners. It smelled of old wood and mildew, but it was dry and felt solid enough. I spent the first day cleaning up. I swept the place out, wiped down the shelves, and set up my sleeping bag on the cot. I stacked the firewood on the porch and tested the hand pump. The water was cold and clear. I boiled some to be safe. I built a fire in the pit and watched the stars come out. It was silent. No cars. No voices. Just the crackle of the fire and the wind in the trees. The first few days were peaceful. I hiked the area during the day, cooked simple meals over the fire, read for hours, and slept longer than I had in years. I felt like I was finally starting to unwind. But on the 4th night, something changed. It started with the feeling that I wasn't alone. I woke up suddenly just after midnight. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers. The cabin was pitch black. I wasn't sure what had woken me. Maybe a sound? I lay there, heart beating harder than it should have, listening. I thought I heard something outside, just a faint crunching noise, like footsteps, but not close, somewhere beyond the tree line. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe even a bear, though I hadn't seen any signs. I sat up, slowly, and grabbed the rifle. I didn't light the lantern. I didn't want to announce where I was. I stayed like that for almost an hour, listening, not hearing anything more. The next morning, I found boot prints in the dirt about 50 feet from the cabin. They weren't mine. Mine were from hiking boots. These were flatter, like work boots or old military-style ones. They came out from the trees, stopped for a bit, then turned and went back into the woods. No other prints, no trash, no tracks, just that. I spent most of that day on edge. I walked a wide circle around the cabin, checking for more signs, but I didn't find anything. No campsites, no gear, no wrappers, no tire marks. I told myself maybe it was someone passing through. A hunter, someone who didn't realize the cabin was occupied. But that didn't explain why they were out there at night, that far off any main trail, and why they didn't approach the cabin. Why they just stood there. That night, I barely slept. I kept the fire going and stayed dressed. I left the lantern off and sat near the window, watching the trees. The following day, I took my rifle and hiked several miles in every direction, hoping to find some explanation. Maybe a nearby hunting camp, or even another cabin. I found nothing, just miles of empty woods and steep ridgelines. That evening, just before sunset, I noticed something strange. One of the chairs had been moved. I knew I hadn't touched it. I had left it pushed under the table. But now it was slightly pulled out, like someone had sat there and then stood up again. My first thought was that I had forgotten I moved it, but I was certain I hadn't. I barely used the table. I checked the rest of the cabin. Nothing missing, no signs of forced entry. But the window latch was loose. It wasn't broken, but it wasn't fully locked. I fixed the latch and jammed a piece of wood into the track, then moved the table in front of the window. That night, I stayed awake again. I kept the rifle in my lap. Around 2 a.m., I heard something, a faint scraping sound, like someone brushing against the wall. I waited, every muscle tensed, but it didn't come again. The next morning, I found a piece of twine on the porch, about 6 inches long, tied into a loop. I hadn't brought any twine. I didn't even have rope with me. The edges were frayed and dark, like it had been exposed to the elements for a while. It hadn't been there the day before. Now I was fully on edge. I started considering leaving. I had 5 more days left, but the tension in my chest hadn't gone away since the boot prints. I packed up some gear, loaded the rifle, and spent the day with my truck parked near the clearing, just in case. But I didn't leave. I told myself it was probably just someone passing through. A hunter, maybe some backwoods hermit who used the cabin in the off-season. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night was the worst. Around midnight, I heard movement again. Closer this time. Definitely footsteps. Not an animal. Heavy. Slow. Crunching across leaves. Then silence. Then the sound of the door handle moving. It didn't open. I had locked it and pushed a cabinet in front of it. But the handle turned back and forth once, slowly, then stopped. I sat there completely still. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. Then footsteps again, moving away. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. The first light, I went outside, rifle ready. There were boot prints again, same as before. They came right up to the porch. Whoever it was had stood there for a while. The prints were deep. Then they turned and went back into the woods. This time, I followed them. It was risky, I know, but I had to see where they were coming from. I followed the tracks for nearly a mile. They weaved through dense brush, crossed a shallow creek, and then disappeared into a narrow ravine. At the bottom of the ravine, I found something I still think about all the time. There was an old hunting blind, half collapsed. Looked like it had been built years ago. But inside, I found a tarp, a few rusted cans, a pile of bones, maybe deer or elk, and a piece of paper pinned to the wall with a nail. It was stained and torn, but on it were drawn several simple maps. All of them showed the clearing where the cabin sat. One had a red X on the back wall of the cabin, right where my cot was. That's when I knew I had to leave. I hiked back fast, packed everything in under 30 minutes, threw it all in the truck, and drove out as fast as the trail would allow. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I didn't even care that I left behind the rest of the firewood or some food. I got back to Denver just before dark. I reported what I found to the local sheriff's department. They took my statement, but they didn't seem too interested. They said the land was technically private but hadn't been claimed or lived on in years. Probably just an old squatter, they said. They sent someone out, but I never heard anything more. I tried reaching out to the guy who rented me the cabin. The PayPal account was closed. The forum post was gone. No contact info. Nothing. Took me months to stop waking up in the middle of the night. I kept the rifle near my... It was the fall of 2017 when I decided I needed to take a break from everything. I was 34 at the time, living in Pittsburgh, working long hours for an IT company, barely seeing daylight. My job was remote, but that only meant I could never really shut it off. I was always staring at a screen, either in a cramped apartment or a crowded cafe, checking tickets, replying to emails, and living in that soft hum of digital noise. I hadn't been out in nature in a long time, and something about the upcoming October felt like it was the right time to unplug for a bit. A guy I used to work with had once mentioned a place up in the mountains near Galitzin State Forest in Pennsylvania, a couple of hours outside of town. He said there was a rental cabin he stayed at once, a simple place, no internet, no cell reception, just trees, a wood stove, and quiet. That was exactly what I needed. I found the listing online. It wasn't on any of the major rental sites, just a small local page with a couple of grainy photos. It showed a dark brown one-story cabin, surrounded by woods, with a narrow gravel road leading up to it. The rental price was low for a week, which made sense considering there was no electricity, no plumbing, and you had to bring your own water. I didn't care. I booked it. I told a few friends and coworkers where I'd be, gave them the general area, and said I'd be out of range for a week. I packed my car with supplies, canned food, dry snacks, several gallons of water, a sleeping bag, a few changes of clothes, a flashlight with extra batteries, a camp stove, and a hatchet I bought specifically for chopping wood. I also brought a hunting knife, which I wasn't trained to use, but it made me feel a bit better knowing I had it. The drive up was quiet. Once I passed the last stretch of highway and hit the smaller rural roads, I started to feel that isolation set in. My GPS stopped working not long after I turned off the paved road onto a loose gravel one. I followed the instructions from the owner's email: pass a red mailbox, go past a hunting sign nailed to a birch tree, make a right after the dried-up creek bed. Eventually, I found the cabin. It was tucked back off the road behind a row of trees, sitting in a clearing that let just enough sunlight through to make it feel less claustrophobic. It was smaller than I expected, maybe 20 feet by 15. A single room with a cot, a table, and a cast-iron stove for heat and cooking. There was an outhouse about 30 yards into the woods behind it, which was clean enough, all things considered. There was also a small shed next to the cabin, padlocked shut. The key I'd been mailed only opened the front door of the cabin. I didn't think much of the shed. Probably storage for the owner's tools or something. The first day went exactly as I hoped. I unpacked, split some firewood, and took a short hike through the woods behind the cabin. I didn't go far, just enough to get a feel for the area. I noticed that once you got 100 yards or so out, the forest got dense fast. The trees closed in and sunlight disappeared, and the ground turned uneven with rocks and thick roots. It wouldn't be hard to get turned around out there. I made a note not to explore too far without marking my path. Back at the cabin, I started a fire in the stove, ate a can of chili with crackers, and read a paperback novel I brought. The quiet was almost too quiet. At night, there were no sounds of cars or people, just the creaking of the trees and the occasional rustle of small animals in the brush. Took a while to fall asleep, but I eventually did. The second day started off peaceful again. I hiked a bit more, stayed close, collected dry wood, made some coffee with the camp stove, and felt good. I didn't see a single other person. Not a car, not a hiker, not even a plane overhead. It was total isolation. But later that afternoon, I noticed something that gave me a weird feeling. I was stacking some chopped wood next to the stove when I glanced out the front window. There was something faint in the dirt near the gravel road, fresh tire tracks. I was sure they hadn't been there the day before. I walked down the gravel path to look. The tracks were deep enough to be new, and they curved slightly like someone had turned around just short of the cabin. But I never heard a car come up. The forest was so quiet that I would have heard an engine or crunching gravel. I stood there for a minute, scanning the woods. Nothing. No sounds. No sign of movement. Back inside the cabin, I tried to ignore it. Maybe someone came to check on the property or got lost and turned around. That made sense. Still, I pushed a small table in front of the door that night just in case. I didn't sleep that well. Every sound outside made me sit up. Branches cracking, leaves moving. Could have been deer or raccoons. Probably was. I kept telling myself that. On the third day, something else happened. When I walked out to the outhouse in the morning, I noticed something on the ground that hadn't been there before. A cigarette butt. It was fresh, not wet or faded. I don't smoke, and I hadn't seen a single sign that anyone else had been here. I scanned the woods again. Still nothing. But the feeling I was alone started to go away. It felt like someone had been watching the place, or worse, had gotten close while I was sleeping. I tried to stay calm. I checked around the cabin, looked at the shed door. It was still locked. I checked the trees. No cameras, no signs of gear. Just woods. But I couldn't shake the feeling anymore. I decided to skip the hike that day. I kept my knife on me, which sounds dumb, but it helped. I cooked near the stove, read some more, and stayed inside once the sun went down. Then, around midnight, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. The fire had burned low. I was shivering, but something else had pulled me out of sleep. Then I heard it. Footsteps outside. Slow ones. Crunching leaves. Not an animal. Heavy enough to be a person. I didn't move. I just sat up on the cot and listened. The steps circled the cabin. Once, twice, then stopped near the front. I sat there in total silence, heart racing. I had no phone, no way to call for help. I didn't have a gun, just a knife and a locked door. I waited like that for hours. No more sounds, just silence. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I stepped outside as the sun came up. Nothing was missing, nothing broken, but in the dirt near the front step were boot prints. Large, deep, definitely not mine. They came right up to the door and turned away. I packed my bag that morning. I didn't care if I had 4 days left. I was done. But when I got in the car and turned the key, nothing happened. The engine didn't even click. Just dead. My battery was new. I hadn't left anything on. I checked under the hood. Not that I'd know what to look for. Everything looked normal. No chewed wires, nothing loose. But it wouldn't start. I was stuck. I thought about walking to the nearest road, but it was miles away. I didn't even know the right direction, and if I picked wrong, I could end up more lost. I went back inside the cabin, locked the door, and spent the day thinking. That night, I didn't light the fire. I didn't want to give away that I was inside. I stayed crouched on the cot with my knife in hand, barely moving. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something again. This time it was closer. Footsteps, then the creak of wood. Someone stepped onto the porch. They were trying the door handle. Slow, soft clicks. Then it stopped. I held my breath. The person stood out there for a while. I could hear them breathing. Then the sound faded. No walking, just gone. The next morning I checked again. More prints. They had stood out there for at least 5 minutes. I made a plan. I wasn't going to wait for whoever it was to break in. I took a full backpack of supplies, filled my canteen, and marked a path through the woods using small red cloth strips I tore from a shirt. I went slow, checking my bearings. After hours of walking, I finally hit an old service road. No cars, but it was something. I followed it until sundown and ended up at a hunting camp with some cabins. No one was there, but there was a posted emergency number nailed to a tree. I used the camp's CB radio, which thankfully still worked, and got through to a ranger station after a few tries. I told them I was stranded and gave as much detail as I could about where I was. A truck came about an hour later. The ranger drove me back to town and had my car towed out the next day. I told the cops everything. They said they'd checked the property, but nothing ever came of it. No signs of forced entry. The shed was still locked, but my car battery had been completely disconnected, deliberately. Wires unscrewed. Someone did that. Someone walked around that cabin for nights, just waiting, watching. They never caught anyone. They never found any fingerprints. I never got a refund. I never went back. I didn't care about the money. I still wake up sometimes thinking I hear someone at my door, just breathing, just standing there, waiting for me to fall asleep. I haven't gone camping since.